randomizer gets kind of disappointing, but I guess I'll have to live with it. Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And it's time for another top 10 list. Right, nearly forgot I was doing a discography review. Well, we're almost done with this one. Just got this video and a worst to best ranking left, and I'll have officially exhausted the topic of the Orb and be able to move on to the next series. I already have plans in mind for who I'm covering next, for what it's worth, but in the meantime, let's talk about some Orb tracks. I don't do top 10 tracks videos very often these days. A lot of the bands I've covered in full series haven't played as well into this format, but the Orb very much are the kind of band you can easily pick apart from an individual track standpoint and get plenty of substance. I feel like one could even possibly make the argument that they're more of a singles band than an albums band. It's not an argument I'm actually going to make. Obviously, it's not like all their singles fall under what one would traditionally expect out of a single, given how long and sprawling many of their tracks can be, and their deep cuts often hit just as big heights as their most popular singles. But my point is that Orb tracks can nearly always stand completely on their own outside of the contexts of their albums and be easily broken down in a format such as this. Also, a decent amount of my favorite tracks are just kind of the obvious big popular ones, so there's that too. So yeah, let's get through the usual disclaimers. As per usual, this is all just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it. Which Orb tracks resonate the most with you can be completely different from those which resonate strongly with me. I have a couple of picks, which are probably going to go against the popular grain. But if you want to post your own lists in the comments, please feel free. This list may also not reflect how I feel in the future, could change in the coming months or years. I think this particular list is pretty well pinned down, and I don't see a lot of my thoughts, like, super fundamentally changing, but, anyway, enough prelude, let's get into the top 10 best Orb songs. Number 10, Oxbow Lakes from Orbis Terrarum. I knew I wanted this spot to belong to something from Orbis Terrarum. Went back and forth between this, Plateau, and White River Junction on which one hit for me the best. But Oxbow Lakes won out in the end. Those opening piano riffs are nothing short of iconic, probably the single most memorable sonic element the whole album had to offer, and the way the track slowly evolves and gets freakier and more experimental as it goes along and twists itself into all these warbling synth rumbles and liquid cascades of percussion, and in spite of how out there and formless many sections of this track can get, it always kept me consistently pulled in and could even feel pretty relaxed. It's one heck of an experience, and a strong demonstration of some of the Orb's greatest strengths, even in spite of the track's 7-minute length being pretty scant by their standards of this era. It sure fits a heck of a lot of cool ideas in that time and feels just as big and expansive as other tracks of theirs which could go on even twice as long. Deserves every bit of love it's gotten over the years. Number 9, Molten Love from Oblivion. Alright, now here we got a bit more of an underappreciated deep cut. This one doesn't have as much progression as Oxbow Lakes, but the appeal isn't too far away. Pretty similar mix of languid cascades of squirting electronic effects that feels pretty well layered. But while this track does feel markedly smaller scale and not as epic or expansive as Oxbow Lakes, there is some magical effect to this one that I've always been drawn to. Probably driven by all those samples of twinkling bells and old-timey string pads that sound like they were taken out of some old 50s romance movie or something. Weird as it may sound, that title, Molten Love, feels perfectly fitting for the kind of experience I get out of it. One could say it doesn't entirely fit among the darker explorations of Oblivion, but I think it works great as this one unambiguous moment of uplifting peace in the track listing that's still just as strange and well-textured as everything around it. Don't let this one go overlooked. Number 8, Once More from Cydonia. Okay, and here's what is most likely going to be the most controversial pick on this list. Cydonia is already a pretty divisive album, very loved or hated among longtime fans, and a track like this, which feels so radio-friendly and straightforward pop-like in a way that's Very much off-brand for the Orb, almost asking to get sellout accusations. But to me, it really doesn't feel like your prototypical sellout move. This feels really genuine, like Dr. Alex just wanted to try something poppier on his own, and not like he was pressured by the label to do so. It may not be nearly as weird or abstract as most Orb tracks, but the vibes are immaculate, all the liquid synth lines and MIDI pianos are super smooth and chill. Aki Amori's vocals fit perfectly over the instrumental, and the tune is really catchy too. It's just an excellent little melancholy slice of trip-hop. I would get it if you didn't like this one, it's certainly not an indicative look of what the Orb is all about, but I've always loved it and thought it worked fantastically well for what it was. Never gotten sick of it over all these years. An underrated opener to an underrated album. Number 7. Spanish Castles in Space from the Orb's Adventures Beyond the Ultraworld. I don't know if I would have thought to include this one on the list proper before I started writing this series, but really chill and laid-back material is obviously a huge part of the Orb's appeal, and when I really thought about it, I think if there is any track in the Orb catalog that is best at putting me at ease and relaxing me, it has to be this one. There's really not much to it at all, just some very slow bass guitar playing from Guy Pratt combined with a few light cymbals, other meandering guitar playing and piano samples, and some narration in another language that I don't think is Spanish, and borders on ASMR without feeling like it's specifically going for that. There's barely any progression over its 15-minute running time, but the sleepy, dreamlike subspace created by all of it is just too effective for that to really matter. I just put it on, let myself fully sink into it, and cease to feel time passing. It could go on for 2 hours and I bet I'd still be just as pulled in. There may be other tracks on Adventures Beyond the Ultraworld that are a lot catchier or have more striking ideas, but I don't know why I never gave this one credit for how perfectly nailed an ambient jam session it is. Absolutely one of the biggest highlights in their whole catalog. Number 6. Montagne d'Or, Der Gute Berg from Orbis Terrarum. Now, this track's appeal is not the same as Spanish Castles in Space. This is a track I love for how epic and sprawling it is and how fantastic its progression is over 10 minutes. While it starts out in similarly tranquil territory with liquid synth effects and meandering steel guitars, as time goes on, the track seems to get progressively bigger and more intense, with some tapping beats and plinking keyboard licks in the middle section that have a more driving and mysterious feel, then eventually paying off in an amazingly hard-hitting final few minutes that have the heaviest banging drum tracks in maybe any Orb track ever, and then finally that very last moment where all the sounds devolve into rising distortion and that one big explosion sound effect at the very end. It is so freaking cool. An experience that needs to be heard for yourself in its full entirety to be believed. Number 5. Towers of Dub from UF Orb. Now here's an obvious pick if there ever was one. The Orb have long been heavily influenced by dub reggae music and incorporate the style all the time in all their albums, either combining it with other genres or sometimes playing it completely straight, as seen with a track like this. I'll admit my experience in straight dub reggae isn't as well developed as it probably should be outside of what the Orb have done within the genre, but Towers of Dub was the first track in this particular style I'd ever heard, and what an introduction to the genre it was. An epic 15-minute jam with the iconic echoing dub beats and voice samples, deep and satisfying bass lines, plinky keyboard loops, and of course tons of harmonicas. There's obviously a whole tradition of artists making more experimental material in dub reggae spaces in the decades before the Orb came around, especially as seen with people like Lee Scratch Perry. But before hearing this track, I didn't even know you could do something so strange and cool sounding with reggae styles. And it remains a gold standard of sorts in my mind whenever I hear other tracks in this style because of how satisfying, memorable, and all around fantastically well done this groove is. An absolute classic, to be sure. Number 4. Into the Fourth Dimension from the Orb's Adventures Beyond the Ultraworld. Okay, so now these top 4 picks are all so close together personal enjoyment-wise it may as well be a 4-way tie for the top spot. Any of them could take that spot depending on my mood. But I love them all for totally different reasons, and it's difficult to compare them. In terms of like big, epic, long-form pieces with lots of interesting progressions over time, this enormous cloud complex has to be the most impressive one of all, featuring all sorts of different sounds from a performance of a 1600s choral piece, violins, rumbling bass synths, low-key narration actually in Spanish, banging beats, jangling percussion patterns, bright trance-like lead synths. There's some cool new evolution introduced in the mix every minute. All of it perfectly adds up to the feeling of a huge mind-expanding journey that sends you across the entire universe at high speed. One of the big centerpiece moments that makes Adventures Beyond the Ultraworld such a towering, untouchable classic, and totally gets to me every time. Number 3. Vuja Day from The Dream.
Please wake up.
Alright, here's another track that I'm guessing isn't going to be consistently showing up on everyone's lists. The Dream is not one of those albums that's everyone's cup of tea, but ever since I first heard Vuja Day in high school, I absolutely loved every single tiny detail about it and could not stop listening to it over and over for days on end, and it's still just as great to me now as it was then. Ultimately, this is the kind of track I tend to think about when I think about the Orb style in passing. Just an absolute clusterfuck of voice samples that sounds like you're in the middle of some kind of ridiculous cartoon city going over a banging dub-influenced beat, with super sticky metallic synth chords and a shouting hook from Aki Amori, which just gives me life. Every single little voice sample is so easily memorable, I can mouth along with every single one of these samples, and there's like 50 of them flying by you in just 5 minutes. And that's not even getting into the track's outro, as the banging groove slowly and progressively melts into tranquil ambience. No one but the Orb could have possibly made Vuja Day, and it is such a blast to listen to every single time. I'm not sure why it never stuck around as a big classic Orb mainstay. I think it deserves to be at least equally as well remembered as this next pick. Number 2. Toxigene from Orblivion.
Now wait a minute.
Toxigene seems to be a turning point of sorts in the Orb's catalog, and among the core fanbase you will find people who absolutely love it or absolutely hate it with pretty much no in-between. As you may guess from its placement this far up the list, I'm not sure I really understand the latter camp of people. I mean, sure, you could theoretically call it more commercial than a lot of the stuff they were doing before, a lot punchier and easier to fit in a radio format than the 15-minute jams they were previously known for. Also supposedly originally conceived as a remix of Jean-Michel Jarre's Oxygen Part 8 that was rejected from becoming an official remix thanks to sounding absolutely nothing like the original. It definitely exemplifies the more playful and silly side to the Orb, like Vuja Day does. Some people prefer these guys when they get more serious, and I guess won't be as drawn to this kind of material. But I don't understand how you can hear a beat that goes this freaking hard and not get completely won over instantly. All the bright flashing melodies, blubbering vocal samples, grimy bass. This thing borders on like being a big beat banger in the vein of the Chemical Brothers, but executed in such a particular way that once again only the Orb would ever do. Not even getting into the album version's 2-minute ambient build-up that makes that break screeching payoff all the more worth it. Yet another absolute classic track that I could never stop listening to in high school and still absolutely love just as much to this day. And even if it's not necessarily their most indicative work, this is probably the Orb track I'd most likely recommend to someone who's never heard any Orb material before, just for how ridiculously immediately it hits. 10 out of 10 track, to be sure. But before I get into the number 1 pick, here's a whole bunch of honorable mentions. Plateau from Orbis Terrarum. Blue Room from UF Orb. A Beautiful Day from The Dream. Supernova at the End of the Universe from the Orb's Adventures Beyond the Ultraworld. The Land of Green Ginger from Bicycles and Tricycles. White River Junction from Orbis Terrarum. Soul Planet from No Sounds Are Out of Bounds. Sphere Side Bull Knife Trophy from Metallic Spheres. Cool Harbor from Okie Dokie It's the Orb Compact. Promise from Cydonia. Perpetual Dawn from the Orb's Adventures Beyond the Ultraworld. Moon Building 2703 AD from Moon Building 2703 AD. Assassin, non-album single. The End of the End from No Sounds Are Out of Bounds. House of Narcotics Opium Wars mix from Abolition of the Royal Familia. Lost and Found from The Dream. Star 6 and 789 from the Orb's Adventures Beyond the Ultraworld. Thursday's Keeper from Cydonia. High Noon from The Dream.
You're not dreaming and you're not in heaven, but thanks for the compliment. Now, take your medication.
A huge, ever-growing, pulsating brain that rules from the center of the Ultraworld repeal session version from the BBC sessions 1989 to 2001. And I think that will be plenty of honorable mentions. I'm gonna stop there. So, may as well get into the last pick. Number 1. Little Fluffy Clouds from the Orb's Adventures Beyond the Ultraworld. Yeah, this is pretty much the most boring and predictable number 1 pick one could make for this list. It is their most well-known track, the one they close most of their live sets with, just the most obvious signature track that will come to anyone's mind if they know of the Orb even in passing. Again, the 3 picks I put right below this have an equal chance of taking this top spot, and I enjoy roughly the same amount for different reasons. But whenever I get stuck on one of these kinds of placements on lists, I always tend to default to whichever one I heard first and have the strongest nostalgia for. And Little Fluffy Clouds is by far the easy winner in that particular department. It was the first Orb track I ever heard, even way back when I was in middle school. Before I knew how to digest their particular brand of meandering ambience, I knew this track and developed a soft spot for it pretty immediately. I'm sure I'm not the only one who can perfectly mouth along with every word of Ricky Lee Jones rambling about Arizona skies. and the beat still bangs, and those delicate little guitar hooks from Steve Reich's electric counterpoint can take me right back to when I was 14, in the days when this haircut was considered long for me. All even more intensified when I hear the significantly more epic live versions like the one which closes out their BBC Sessions compilation, which really play into this track's long-standing reputation. It may have been originally conceived as like a quick little borderline shitpost where the joke is LOL Ricky Lee Jones sounds like she's on drugs, but it's a shitpost that's endured for 30 plus years because it can so instantly put so many people in a good mood, all the way up to present day. It may not be my favorite by a huge margin, but I don't know what else would have been more fitting to call my favorite track by The Orb. And there we go, that's the list. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.